Paul's authority, again, some false apostles, and some weakness, lots and lots of weakness. Today on another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Today we're going through 2 Corinthians chapter 10 through 13, and tomorrow we're going to go through Acts chapter 20 verses 1 through 3. That's right, only 3 verses in Acts chapter 20 tomorrow, plus Romans chapter 1 through 3. So let's dive in and see what we get today. In chapter 10, this is all about Paul's apostolic authority. Again, he's talking about his authority. Now, these words here, though, in verse 1, now I, Paul, they mark the most important transition in the epistle. The first 9 chapters of 2 Corinthians have been warm and fuzzy and encouraging, right? Here the language dramatically changes to a harsh, threatening tone because Paul was on the defensive against charges that were made by these false apostles. So Paul planned to challenge certain people who had accused him of behaving according to the flesh, that is, according to human standards alone. In verses 3 through 4, Paul often used language of battle and struggle, but there is a right way and a wrong way to fight. Christians here should resort neither to the literal weapons of warfare nor to the rhetorical weapons of sophisticated philosophical reasoning to advance the gospel. We really just need Jesus is what it all boils down to. And we get to verses 7 through 11 here. Now in verse 8 it says, for I boast a little too much about our authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for tearing you down. I will not be put to shame. I don't want to seem as though I am trying to terrify you with my letters. For it is said, his letters are weighty and powerful, but his physical presence is weak, and his public speaking amounts to nothing. Wow, talk about a shot. And Paul knew they were telling this about him. So through this section here, like verse 7, one clique in the Corinthian church here, and perhaps the false teachers, had arrogantly claimed that I belong to Christ, but they excluded everybody else. It's kind of one of those, well, I belong to Christ, but you don't, nan boo boo type thing, I guess you could say. But Paul really condemned this divisiveness that they were doing, because there is no inner circle in Christianity that's made up of an especially enlightened group. It just doesn't. And if you think there is and you think you're a part of it, you're probably part of the problem as well. So on through this section, we get to verses 9 and 10. Of course, Paul's earlier correspondence caused the Corinthians to be grieved, but it was for their own good, and it was not done just to frighten them. The false apostles contrasted the powerful impact of his letters with the very weak impact of his presence and his lack of oratorical skill in his public speaking, supposing this was proof of some major defect in the apostle. But the false apostles were very good at self-promotion or commending themselves. For people to use themselves as the standard for evaluating their ministry shows that they truly lacked understanding of what was going on here. So let's move on to chapter 11. We'll get into chapter 11 and get to verse 9. It says, when I was present with you and in need, I did not burden anyone, since the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my needs. Who were those brothers, right? Well, the brothers who came from Macedonia were Silas and Timothy. Now, after planting Macedonian churches in Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea, Paul had traveled to this area here alone, stopping in Athens, and then he was only there briefly until he settled in Corinth, here where we are now, supporting himself as a tent maker. So he was working and supporting himself. But sometime later, his traveling partner Silas and Timothy caught up with him, and they had collected sufficient funds from Macedonian churches that enabled Paul to devote full attention to his ministry at this point, right? I did want to point out super apostles up in verse 5. The word super apostle is a combination of an adjective meaning superior and of course, the usual New Testament word for apostle. So the only other place in the New Testament where this word appears is in chapter 12, verse 11. The quotation marks indicate that Paul's disdain for such a designation of those who were troubling the Corinthian super apostles. Dun, 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 dun. Well, they're definitely not that super in my opinion, but okay. We'll move on from that part. And then Paul talks a whole lot about suffering now in chapter 11, verse 6, all the way to chapter 12, verse 10. And Bible interpreters have often identified these verses as Paul's fool's speech. In order to defend himself against these false apostles, he boasted about experiences that he had, many of which would usually be considered evidences of shame or humiliation. Yet the false teachers couldn't come close to matching Paul's record when it's all said and done. So we'll move on to chapter 12 from here. In chapter 12, getting to verse 7, pretty much through 10-ish, and it says, therefore, so that I would not exalt myself, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a message of Satan to torment me, so that I would not exalt myself. Concerning this, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Therefore, I will most gladly boast all the more about my weakness, so that Christ's power may reside in me. So I take pleasure in weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and in difficulties, for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So, Paul did not say that what this thorn in his flesh was, although the Corinthians probably knew. Suggestions about the thorn have included physical ailments, poor eyesight, ill health, psychological or spiritual ailments such as depression or demonic oppression, or an ongoing temptation from a bodily desire, and opposition to his ministry. Enemies both inside and outside of the church would make this up. Now, the sufficiency of divine grace may be easier to grasp intellectually than through experience, especially for those who are naturally inclined to self-reliance. I kind of fall into that category. And God ensured that Paul never got away from grace. God's glorious power is more evident when it is displayed in weak vessels. And I kind of look at Paul and I think of it like what the guy said, he was kind of weak in stature and his oratory skills weren't that great. I think, man, if God can use this guy, surely he can use either one of us, right? So all of Paul's sufferings, which he recapped here in 5 short phrases, became occasions for him to be pleased or delighted. And then, of course, we'll move on from there to verse 14. It says, look, I'm ready to come to you this 3rd time. Well, Paul's first visit to the Corinthians was the long church planting visit around AD 50 and 51. His second visit was that brief, painful experience that we talked about. Earlier in the letter, he had promised a 3rd visit. Now, this was fulfilled as Romans chapter 15:26 shows, but Paul would not burden the Corinthians by asking for money for his personal use. He wanted their hearts and affections, not their money. Paul felt a fatherly love for the Corinthians, and he yearned for this love to be returned, even though he did not expect the Corinthians to love him as much as he loved them. So then we get into the last chapter, chapter 13, and verse 2 here stuck out like a sore thumb to me. It says, I gave a warning when I was present the 2nd time, and now I give a warning while I am absent to those who sinned before and to all the rest. If I come again, I will not be lenient. He is laying it down for him right here. Paul would not be lenient on his planned 3rd visit to the Corinthians. His sense of apostolic authority is nowhere more evident than in this verse right here in our reading today. So I hope this has touched you in some way and helped you with your studies. If it has, click the like button, subscribe button. Of course, click the little jingle bell so you can get notified the next time I upload a video. If you're rumbling with me on Rumble, hit that little boxing glove. And I will see you tomorrow for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. I'll see you then.